Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a diplomatic move that seems purely administrative. A visa restriction.
Just paperwork.
Exactly, just paperwork. But then it suddenly escalates, not just into a spat, but into this global political statement about dignity and power. We're talking about Mali and Burkina Faso's recent decision to ban Americans from receiving visas.
And they framed it in that one very powerful word: reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
What's so fascinating here is that, on the surface, it looks like this neat, almost mathematical symmetry. If you bar our citizens, we bar yours.
A perfect mirror.
But in geopolitical practice, it functions as a highly visible diplomatic flare. It signals just how thin, how tense, and how transactional major parts of the U.S.-Africa relationship have become.
Absolutely. This is so much more than a paperwork shuffle at an airport counter. It feels like a moment of acute diplomatic stress that just crystallizes years of frustration.
It does.
So our deep dive today is into this rise of visa reciprocity. We're going to look at the immediate triggers, analyze the deep political drivers behind these tit-for-tat actions, and critically connect this seemingly bureaucratic fight to these far broader shifts in U.S. policy.
Across trade, aid, and diplomacy.
All of it. And that's what makes this moment so significant for you to understand.
It's essential context, really, for anyone trying to track contemporary African diplomacy. These seemingly small border control actions, they reflect this profound frustration with how major powers, specifically the U.S., have been engaging with them.
Primarily through that narrow security lens.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start by grounding this in the facts. The immediate spark that lit this fire. Let's dig into the immediate spark. Visa reciprocity as political principle. What was the specific U.S. action here?
Well, the direct prompt was quite specific and very formalized. It came from President Donald Trump, who issued what's known as Proclamation 10998 on December 16th. And the stated purpose was all about tightening entry and visa rules in the name of, enhancing national security and public safety.
And the timing on this is an interesting detail, isn't it? Because the ban wasn't immediate, which you'd expect for an urgent security measure.
That's a crucial point. It was set to take effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on January 1st, 2026.
So more than a year out, we're talking about a future mandate that provoked this almost instantaneous current response. That lag time tells you a lot about the political calculation.
It does. It wasn't just a threat. It was a firm policy declaration with an implementation date. It gave time for diplomatic maneuvering, or in this case, retaliation.
And what was the scope? How many countries were we talking about?
The scope of Proclamation 1998 was immense. The U.S. State Department confirmed it suspended or limited entry for nationals of 39 countries globally.
39.
And importantly, it also applied to people using travel documents issued or endorsed by the Palestinian Authority.
39 countries is a massive net to cast. So right away, this tells us the U.S. action is broad, based on some kind of global risk assessment, and not just targeted at the Sahel.
Correct. But the reaction from the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad has been the loudest and most politically charged.
So to understand that reaction, we have to dig into the official justification from the administration.
Right. And their reasoning, it relies heavily on these specific, very technical mechanics of border control, which they've then elevated into foreign policy principles.
What kind of mechanics?
The proclamation cited familiar things: deficiencies in screening and vetting processes, information sharing gaps, high overstay rates, and what they called failures to accept deported nationals back into their home countries.
Okay, so this is where the policy discussion really bleeds into the political one, because these issues, vetting, overstays, repatriation, they are, bureaucratic realities on paper.
They are.
But the act of issuing a ban based on them is an implicit declaration of mistrust toward the entire state apparatus of that country.
Precisely. You've hit the nail on the head. The political message completely overwhelms the technical requirement. A visa ban isn't just logistics, it's an official public signal of who is trusted and who is suspect.
Who is just too much trouble to deal with.
Right. So the response from Mali and Burkina Faso, it was less about debating those bureaucratic points and more about rejecting the power dynamic of the ban itself.
So if the U.S. issues a declaration of mistrust, the response is a declaration of defiance.
That's it.
And it was striking. Mali and Burkina Faso announced they would no longer grant visas to Americans, and they stated clearly it was a decision of high principle. If Washington bars our citizens, we will bar Washington's.
It's a clean, diplomatic mirror image, a performance of equal standing, even when the economic and diplomatic reality is anything but equal. And that performance is really the foundation of their strategy here.
Which leads us right to our next point, the logic of defiance.
Yeah.
Spreading bans and unequal leverage.
Right, because Mali and Burkina Faso weren't acting in a vacuum here.
This idea, this concept of reciprocity as defiance, it seems to have caught on very quickly in the region. There was the clear contagion effect.
There was. Reuters reported that the transitional government in Niger announced on December 25th it would also stop issuing visas to U.S. citizens.
Joining its neighbors almost immediately.
And even this had a precedent. Chad had already suspended visas for Americans back in June after being included in an earlier round of U.S. travel restrictions. So you see this cluster of responses across the Sahel. It indicates coordination, a shared strategic goal.
And that technical justification from the U.S., it really reveals the heart of the inequality, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Washington cited failures to provide samples of electronic identity documents or inadequate information sharing on lost and stolen passports.
So it's basically Washington saying, your systems are not up to our technical standards.
That is exactly the message. And when you're dealing with nations that have vastly different economic, military, and tech leverage, you have to be tactical. And that's why reciprocity is often called a tool of the weak in asymmetric diplomacy.
Meaning nations reach for the tools that are
Cheap, fast, and symbolically loud.
Okay, let's break that down. Why is a visa ban cheap in this situation?
Because it requires almost no institutional overhead, zero major financial cost. Think about it. If they wanted to use counter tariffs, they need huge economic leverage and a complex bureaucracy to manage all.
Leverage they just don't have.
Exactly. But a visa ban, you just use the immigration infrastructure you already have. It's an instant foreign policy decision you can make overnight.
And its loudness is critical, especially for these military-led governments in the Sahel who are under immense pressure to prove their own legitimacy.
Precisely. And to get the full picture, you have to look at the Sahel bloc context. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have deliberately positioned themselves as a unified geopolitical bloc explicitly outside the old Western orbit.
They even signed a confederation treaty, right?
They did. They are signaling a joint, unified path, and they're actively moving beyond the pressure from the regional body, ECOWAS, which has been pushing for a return to democratic rule.
That's a fascinating layer. So the visa ban isn't just a response to Washington. It's also a performance for their regional neighbors and for their own citizens to show they're serious about this new autonomous alignment.
Exactly. The collective ban reinforces their unified stance against what they see as external interference, whether that comes from the West or from a body like ECOWAS.
So we can see two major internal functions for these bans. Both seem like political survival mechanisms for these regimes.
The first is about converting humiliation to defiance. A U.S. ban, especially one based on claims of systemic weakness, is easily framed at home as disrespect, as humiliation.
So the counterban.
The counterban immediately transforms that perceived slight into this performance of strong sovereignty. The regimes are telling their people, we refuse to be subservient to Washington.
And the second point, which is so crucial for leaders struggling with instability, is shifting the argument.
Yes. Instead of being forced to answer for really sensitive internal problems like insecurity from extremist groups or their own institutional weakness, they can just point to the high ground of national dignity. They're essentially saying the real threat is foreign interference and we won't be lectured.
That narrative redirects public anger away from any failures of governance and toward this big symbolic fight. Yeah. It's a powerful domestic political win, even if it's temporary.
Very powerful.
But if that's the political payoff, we have to ask about the strategic cost. And this leads to a really counterintuitive idea that reciprocity is not the same thing as diplomatic leverage.
That's the analysis on the practical cost. Because while the symbolic signal is loud, the practical cost to Washington is minimal. And that undermines the whole idea of leverage.
How so?
Well, Americans are not the main tourist market for these countries. And private travel to these conflict-affected Sahel states, because of the very real and entrenched terrorist threat, is already extremely limited.
But wait, what about the cost to U.S. counterterrorism intelligence or personnel safety? What if they can't send in security analysts or NGO staff or researchers? How do we measure that diplomatic cost?
Well, that's the real long-term damage. And that cost actually lands much closer to the nations imposing the ban. By freezing movement, they lose what you could call the slow, boring connective tissue of diplomacy.
That's a great phrase.
It means fewer legitimate business visitors, fewer NGO staff delivering essential services, and fewer long-term researchers who could provide vital insights. A tit-for-tat visa ban, a sharp instrument, it rarely fixes the underlying problem, and it actively damages the channels you need for long-term capacity building.
And ironically, the very channels you need for counterterrorism efforts.
Exactly.
So this raises a critical question for us to think about. If these sharp tools rarely work and can actually harm the local economy and aid flows, why do these governments keep using them?
And the answer, as you suggested, lies almost entirely in that symbolic power of rejecting perceived external control, even if it's strategically and economically a bad move in the long run.
That realization takes us to our next big theme, the security lens trap. When risk management damages strategy, it seems we need to look at the deeper driver here, which is how America's security lens has basically swallowed the entire relationship.
It has. It's reduced these complex partnerships to purely transactional risk assessments.
When you look at the U.S. travel ban architecture, it's so clear that it's built on a logic that sees all cross-border movement as a risk management problem.
It's treating the national border like a firewall that has to be perfect, instead of a point of strategic engagement.
And the scale of this is what's different now. The Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR, they noted that the December expansion added several countries, and that other partial restrictions apply to an even wider list.
It affects millions of people globally, and Africa appears to be disproportionately caught in this net, even compared to other regions with similar instability issues.
The core argument from Washington is that weak documentation systems, inadequate biometrics, poor record sharing, make vetting impossible at scale.
And crucially, this justification gains real political power when you pair it with the fear language of terrorism.
And we have to acknowledge, in the Sahel, that fear language is not invented. Violent extremism is a real, deeply entrenched issue in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso.
It is. However, relying solely on that security justification to drive your entire foreign policy creates a huge strategic problem for Washington.
What's the ultimate fallout when security, defined only by risk reduction, becomes the only game in town?
That's the core of the problem. A security-first relationship produces only security-first outcomes, even when the damage to broader U.S. interests is severe. It has three major negative effects that actively undermine America's own long-term goals.
Okay, let's spend some time on those three, starting with alienation.
Right. When you use a blanket ban, you immediately alienate ordinary citizens, people who have absolutely no connection to insurgencies.
People just trying to travel for business or school or to see family.
Exactly. And when their travel is suddenly cut off because of their government's failings they can't control, it creates this immediate resentment. And it's directed not at the extremists, but at the nation that issued the ban. It confirms the narrative that the U.S. is hostile to them as a people.
The second strategic damage is reduced cooperation.
Yes. The ban basically substitutes punishment for capacity building. Instead of offering targeted training or resources to help improve their local systems, the U.S. just imposes a penalty.
Which kills any incentive for them to cooperate on things like deportations or information sharing.
Why would they? They can just say, why should we help you vet our citizens if the outcome is still a closed border and public humiliation?
And the third point seems the most strategically dangerous for long-term U.S. interests. Rival invitation.
Absolutely. When the U.S. prioritizes these security restrictions over genuine engagement, it leaves a huge strategic vacuum. And this invites rival powers, especially Russia and China, to present themselves as less judgmental, more accommodating partners.
They just step into the gap.
They step in to fill the diplomatic and capacity vacuum, often without the same demands for democratic reform or institutional integrity that the West might impose. The security lens doesn't just push partners away, it directs them straight toward your rivals.
Let's pause on that idea of the security lens, because it seems like the central pressure point. If you trace this thinking to its logical conclusion, the travel ban actually risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
This is where it gets deeply problematic. The core claim is, we can't trust your documentation systems because they're deficient.
Okay.
But that stance quickly becomes, we don't work with your systems because you freeze contact, you cut technical support, you reduce your diplomatic presence.
And the final tragic outcome of that isolation is,
your systems don't improve.
So the U.S. creates a policy to mitigate risk from weak systems, but the policy itself ensures those systems never get a chance to be modernized or integrated.
Exactly. Trust is the prerequisite for improving system integrity, especially when you're talking about sharing sensitive data. This ban dismantles that trust. It creates a negative feedback loop where security concerns justify distance, and distance guarantees the security concerns will never be addressed. It's a strategic disaster masquerading as prudent risk management.
And if this were just about visas, the story would be narrow. But it's not. This dispute is a mirror, and it's reflecting these visible structural shifts in Washington's posture across the entire continent.
In trade, aid, and diplomacy.
So let's move to that, the mirror effect. Broader shifts in the U.S.-Africa relationship.
This visa fight is happening against a backdrop of wider uncertainty and this perception of American retrenchment from the continent. That's why this diplomatic flare is so much hotter than it would be otherwise.
Let's start with subpoint 4A, trade from preference to pressure. The main program here is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA.
AGOA has been the cornerstone of U.S.-Africa trade for decades. It grants crucial duty-free access to the U.S. market for thousands of African products, but it reached a critical expiry point in late September 2025.
And the signals about its renewal were not exactly reassuring for African governments.
Far from it. The administration supported only a one-year extension, even while the whole long-term future of the framework was up in the air.
And that kind of short-term uncertainty is incredibly damaging.
Immensely. Businesses that need big upfront capital investment, like a textile mill, they can't make multi-million-dollar decisions based on a one-year promise of tariff-free access. They need 5-10 years of predictable policy.
So the one-year extension signals that AGO isn't a long-term development tool anymore, but more of a short-term political lever.
A lever that can be pulled back at any time. And that uncertainty was compounded by this wider tariff approach. We saw it specifically with South Africa, a huge economy on the continent.
Yeah.
They faced a planned 30% tariff on imports into the U.S.
30% is a massive tariff.
It's a significant escalation. It targets key sectors, threatens thousands of jobs, and Pretoria's position was that this was based on an inaccurate view of the trade relationship.
So the shift is fundamental. A relationship built around tariffs is inherently adversarial. It assumes your partner's trying to get one over on you unless you force them to concede.
It changes the entire tone from partnership, which was the stated goal of AGOA, to one of pressure and competition.
Yeah.
And when the economic relationship is already structured that way, it's no surprise that diplomacy breaks down over something like a visa restriction. The pressure is already there.
Exactly. Okay, let's move to subpoint 4B. Aid shrinking America's soft power footprint. This has a direct impact on stability and humanitarian capacity.
Reuters reported significant foreign aid cutbacks by the administration, actions that effectively shut down USAID operations in some key areas. And these weren't just small budget adjustments. They had immediate, real-world consequences.
How far-reaching was this? The sources suggest it disrupted delivery channels for food and medical aid, throwing humanitarian operations into chaos.
It's a massive shock to the system, especially in unstable regions like the Sahel that are already facing internal displacement and famine risk. And it's not just about losing the money, it's about losing the delivery infrastructure, the local contracts, the logistics, the staff expertise that takes years to build.
And the strategic implication is obvious.
It is. When you pull back from long-term investment in stability, you leave a vacuum. It creates space for instability to grow, and it, once again, invites other global actors to step in and fill that strategic gap, expanding their own influence at Washington's expense.
It's the ultimate cost of disengagement. If you're not using soft power tools like aid and trade, the only tools left are hard power. Security engagement or punishments like sanctions and travel bans.
Which brings us to subpoint 4C, diplomacy, fewer diplomats, more suspicion. The human capital of diplomacy took a major hit as well.
Reuters reported the recall of nearly 30 ambassadors and senior career diplomats as part of an America First mission reshaping.
And this was on top of the fact that African posts were already dealing with major vacancies.
30 ambassadors, that's a huge number. Diplomatic presence matters. Ambassadors are the conduits of trust, context, communication. When they're gone, who is talking to the local political elite? Who is interpreting events?
Their absence means misunderstandings multiply. Diplomacy defaults to what you might call confidential back-channel diplomacy, sporadic, secretive communication.
And secrecy fuels conspiracy narratives, doesn't it? Especially in politically polarized places like the Sahel.
Absolutely. When people don't see a transparent relationship working, they don't see diplomats engaging, aid workers on the ground, trade benefits flowing, They assume the relationship is working against them behind closed doors.
And the visa ban just confirms those suspicions.
It does. The bans are the visible consequence of a strategic retreat across all three pillars of engagement. The relationship was already strained before the visa fight even started.
So now we have to ask the critical question in our next section, the cost of the conflict. Irony and strategic imprecision. We have to consider the crushing irony here, that these bans often actively hurt the very outcomes both sides claim they want.
Look at the stated goals. Washington says it wants better vetting, cooperation on deportations, more credible ID systems.
And the Sahel governments say they want dignity, sovereignty, and stable states.
The fundamental issue is that the visa wars move everyone away from achieving those outcomes. The tools being used, reciprocal bans, punitive restrictions, are directly counterproductive.
Let's break down how solutions are missed. Take screening systems.
You improve screening through technical cooperation, training, and shared standards. You build capability together. You do not improve systems by freezing contact and publicly condemning them. That just ensures the systems stay isolated and weak.
And deportation cooperation.
Yeah.
That's a political tightrope for any government.
It is. And you secure that cooperation through negotiated agreements that respect domestic politics. You find a way for the local government to justify it to their own people without losing face. You don't get it through mutual humiliation. You need an incentive, not a penalty.
And finally, irregular migration pathways.
You reduce those by keeping legal pathways predictable and viable. When you close legal pathways abruptly, you just force people into the hands of smugglers.
The granularity problem is so clear here. Even if the U.S. has a legitimate concern about one bureaucratic weakness, a blanket restriction is the wrong tool. It might be politically efficient, it looks tough, but it's strategically imprecise.
Totally imprecise. You're targeting researchers, public health workers, and business people right alongside any potential criminals. You lose all that valuable connective tissue. It's using a shotgun when you need a scalpel.
We also have to acknowledge the potential for African self-sabotage here. While a sweeping ban on Americans signals strength domestically.
It also signals risk and volatility to the global investment community who are already wary of the Sahel.
Right. Investors want predictability.
Yeah.
If a government is willing to sacrifice essential diplomatic and economic links for a temporary symbolic win, what does that say about their long-term stability?
It suggests volatility. And it brings us to a better definition of strength. Sovereignty isn't just the right to say no loudly. It's more profoundly the capacity to make yes meaningful.
The capacity to say yes to a stable trade deal, yes to a secure investment, yes to open borders.
That requires systemic strength, a much more powerful display of sovereignty than a temporary retaliatory ban, which, while politically satisfying, doesn't build capacity, it actually degrades it.
So if the current approach is strategically broken for both sides, what would a meaningful, smarter reset look like? This brings us to moving beyond tit-for-tat. A framework for a smarter reset.
Based on the dispute, a better approach would start with 3 practical focus steps. Steps that move the conversation from dignity versus security to cooperation versus isolation.
Okay, step 1, narrow the problem. This goes right at that strategic imprecision we talked about.
Right. If the real issue is documentation integrity or deportee returns, the stated criteria in the proclamation, then diplomacy has to negotiate specifically around that issue country by country. The diplomatic approach has to be as specific as the proclamation's criteria.
So you move from a blanket ban to focused compliance requirements. You offer a clear path out.
Exactly. And that leads to step 2, trade reciprocity for benchmarks. You move from confrontation back to negotiation.
What kind of tangible, measurable benchmarks are we talking about here?
Well, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad could offer tangible reforms in exchange for a phased restoration of visa categories. Things like civil registry upgrades, establishing biometric passport integrity, and creating established repatriation protocols that are agreed upon by both sides.
And this would be framed as a negotiated deal, not charity.
Exactly, an exchange where both sides get a measurable outcome. It elevates the relationship from a shouting match to a collaborative project, which aligns with Washington's stated goals.
And finally,
Step 3. Rebuild visible diplomacy. This is essential to address the vacuum that has fed so much distrust.
you mean staffing and public engagement are key to rebuilding that trust on the ground?
Yes. When the relationship is managed primarily through bans, sanctions, and secret meetings, distrust becomes the default. You need a consistent, high-profile presence, fully staffed embassies, high-profile visits, and transparent public communication about mutual goals. That's how you dispel conspiracy narratives.
If a reset like this doesn't happen, the tit-for-tat cycle will just continue.
It will, simply because it's the path of least political resistance. It's easy.
And easy tools are what governments reach for when politics are heated and trust is critically low.
It takes real political effort to do the hard work of rebuilding diplomatic channels, but the long-term benefits, stability, intelligence sharing, economic engagement, are far greater than the temporary political gain of a retaliatory visa ban.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, watching this unfold? Our deep dive into these reciprocity wars shows us that this conflict isn't really about airports or visas. It's about a fundamental collapse of confidence in the U.S.-Africa relationship.
It's been accelerated by a U.S. strategic retreat across trade, aid, and diplomacy. For you, here are the 3 critical takeaways you should carry forward from this.
Okay.
1. Reciprocity is a symbolic weapon of defiance used by states with unequal leverage, like in the Sahel. Its main function is political. A cheap, fast way to shift the domestic focus from tough internal problems to the high ground of national dignity.
Right.
2. The U.S. security-first architecture creates strategic alienation. It focuses on punishment through restrictions rather than capacity building through cooperation. And this approach risks becoming that self-fulfilling prophecy, ensuring the very systems Washington wants to see improved stay isolated and weak.
And the third?
3. The visa conflict reflects a wider retreat across all the essential areas of engagement. Trade, with AGOA uncertainty and tariffs. Aid, with USAID shutdowns. And diplomacy, with all those ambassador vacancies feeding public distrust.
So the entire visa ban story, which seems so specific and bureaucratic on the surface, it really boils down to this profound philosophical fight over who gets to define security, dignity, and sovereignty in a rapidly changing global order. Is sovereignty best expressed by the right to say no loudly in defiance, or by the inherent capacity to build systems strong enough to enable a meaningful, beneficial yes to the world? That's something for you to mull over as you watch how this fragile strategic dynamic plays out over the next few years.